Assalamualaikum and good morning. I'm Muhammad Shahidi, our moderator for today, and I am delighted to welcome everyone to the National Competitiveness Webinar, a webinar series brought to you by Malaysia Productivity Corporation, or MPC. First and foremost, I would like to thank MPC for organizing today's webinar, to our speaker, Mr. Eddie, and to the viewers for spending a morning to learn and know more about behavioral insight. As we all know, today's topic is Behavioral Insight Framework Series 2, where Mr. Eddie will share with us behavioral insight, design strategies, and on understanding our core policy tweaks and policy design tools. It's going to be very interesting. I would like to recall a bit from the last series, the first session where Mr. Eddie shared the principle and theories of behavioral insight and how behavioral insight can be used as a policy tool. Mr. Eddie previously shared about biases, about nudging our behavior, and becoming a choice architecture. He also shared information about how other countries applied behavioral insight in their countries and how we can also do the same. And today, we will have the chance to hear on the strategy and how to do that. I welcome everyone to participate, to ask questions, give opinion, and even share your thoughts. You can write down your question in the chat area or in the Q&A column. I will try my best to relay the question or opinion to our speaker, Mr. Eddie Razak. And that brings us to our speaker, Mr. Eddie. Mr. Eddie Razak is a senior advisor at Eden Strategy Institute, Singapore, an institution providing advisory and professional consultancy services internationally for governments and corporations on policy and on innovation. Mr. Eddie was formerly Executive Vice President at the National Innovation Agency under the Malaysian government. Prior to that, he was a prominent figure in the corporate world and did a lot of voluntary work in education and in social services. In terms of education, Mr. Eddie completed his Master in Public Management as a Lee Kuan Yew Fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at National Universities of Singapore and John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He did his undergraduate at the University of Maryland, where he obtained 2 bachelors of science degrees, one in finance and one in management science and statistics. And latest development info that I got from Facebook is that Mr. Eddie is now the president of Malaysia alumni of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Congrats, sir. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Mr. Eddie. Silakan.
Thank you, Shahidi, and thank you to Malaysia Productivity Corporation for inviting me to do this webinar. Now, as mentioned, this is the second of 3 webinars. Thank you for that long introduction. Well, we have a lot of things to cover. As I mentioned, the second of 3 sessions. The first session, we covered principles and theories. And today we're going to look at how to design those interventions. And the third session will be on the 9th of February. We'll talk about the delivery. So there's a lot to cover, so I'll go right straight into it. Yeah. So you can see on the site the principles and theories. We talked a bit about human model, heuristics, nudging, framework, and all that. Now we're going to talk about a bit about implementing this framework that we call the PRIME framework. Now, the way that we have formulated this, behavioral insights is a practice. But we now associate it with how you as policymakers implement these interventions within your policies. So when I say policymakers, it's mostly government, but it can also be corporations. Corporations also have policies, HR policy, customer policy, etc. But usually when governments and all that, when they try to implement policies, we want to make sure that the policies are effective, that they take into account people's behaviors, and then the outcomes will be the desired outcomes. Okay, so let's get into it, yeah? Now, last week I flashed this, but I didn't explain it. But today we're going to go into it. We're going to go into the first three of these blocks, which is PRI. And in the next session, we're going to cover ME. The reason is that there's a lot to cover, and I don't want to inundate you with too much information. So we look at the purpose and the research and the intervention. Now, think of this as a way that when you want to implement the behavioral insights, you as policymakers, you look at it holistically. You look at it from the beginning, from where the purpose that you want to do this, right to the end, and how you expand those interventions. Yeah. So let's go to the first one, P, purpose. Yeah. Now, policymakers are quite familiar with this. How the policy cycle. You look at the big policy areas, right? So this is where we try to filter down. We think of it this way, right? First, when you want to implement an intervention, let's say you want to reduce cigarette smoking, you need to look at the broad policy aspiration. What is it that you're looking at? And then you zoom down to your intended outcomes. These intended outcomes should be measurable outcomes. Then you identify what is the demographic of the people you want to refer to. Who are the people? And then what is that change, the behavioral change that you want from this demographic? And you need to look at whether these changes can be measured reliably. So for instance, when you put the picture on the cigarette box, how do you measure that? Have you thought about how you measure whether there's behavior change from that? So this is an example. Look at the bottom there. So for instance, we look at healthcare policy. Let's say we want to reduce or we want to manage type 2 diabetes, but we want to manage it according to a demographic of gender, race, age group, location, etc., etc. And then how do you look at the data? You look at, what is the percentages or averages among what kind of population over what kind of time frame. This is how you look at the purpose. I won't go too deep into this because academics will know how do you actually look at how do you break down this into a policy cycle. But I'm just showing you that this is how you start those interventions with thinking about the purpose. Then after purpose, you look at a bit of research. You go into a bit of research into it. Now, there's many things that you can research, but I want to touch on this, something very interesting. If you remember last week, for those of you who have joined, I talked about heuristics and biases. Heuristics are, your mental shortcuts or rules of thumbs. Biases are what you already are ingrained that you believe in. Okay, we have that. As humans, we have that. It is natural for humans to have that. But there's a few more things that become bottlenecks in our decision making. So we as people, we have limited attention spans. We struggle with our willpower. We are often attached to our own identities. And we actually care about how society feels, about what we do. So what happens because we have these bottlenecks is that quite often we as humans have struggle with making good decisions. So quite often you see we make bad decisions because we have these bottlenecks in our mental cognitive capabilities. So humans are not perfectly rational actors. In economics, you assume humans are rational. So you give them the incentives, you set the price and, you give them the knowledge and all that. People will go and accept whatever you're proposing. But in reality, people struggle with these bottlenecks. Now, let me explain a bit about these bottlenecks. Let's look at the first one. Okay, attention span. Did you know that humans actually have less attention span than a goldfish? So goldfish are actually better than humans in this. In the 2000s, the attention span was like 12 seconds, but that was before, smartphones were invented, long before smartphones were invented. But now we struggle with attention span more and more because we're inundated with more and more information. Now, that being the case, these are a couple of examples. I thought, better for you to digest this information if you look at some examples. So let's look at the first one. In the Dominican Republic, they want to educate people about finances. So they have financial literacy programs. But financial literacy is complicated. You got, interest rate or profit rate, and you have, a net present value. But they come up with it based on simple rules of thumb that people can use easily. That means that you think of your financial outcomes according to rules of thumb, whether it is beneficial or not. And they have found that this actually increases adoption of good financial practices. Another example, in the US, apparently about close to 100,000 people have their limbs cut off every year because of diabetes. So what causes diabetes? One is, of course, your eating habits, right? Your diet, if you consume a lot of sugar, for instance, right? But diabetes and other diseases like even AIDS and tuberculosis, TB, and all that, you actually have medication which can actually manage that. But quite often, not only you need to manage people's behavior in terms of their diet, in the case of diabetes, you also need to manage their consumption of medication. So many of them have received medication, but they don't take the medication. So they simply forget, or they are just not focused on it because of this attention span issue. So if you focus on this, actually getting people to take medication, it actually reduces the outcome. So for instance, in our case, let's say Ministry of Health, we also want to reduce the cases of diabetes because it costs the government a lot of money to manage diabetes, to run dialysis centers and all the medication and all that. And once medicine is given, also you want people to take it. So this is where it is not science, it's actually behaviors that will induce people to have the good behavior of taking those medicines. Like reminders, for instance, in South Africa, for instance, these have been proven to be effective. Now, next, willpower. People struggle with their willpower. So that newspaper cutting at the side, yuran boleh kutip kemudian. A lot of parents, they struggle with the beginning of the year. They have to pay a lot of school fees. They have to buy the clothes for their children. Not now, of course. Now it's all, study from home. Right? But normally you have to pay a lot. And then they don't have enough. What they could do, of course, is to save money. But it's not that easy, because to have the willpower to save the money for the beginning of the year is quite hard. So if you look at the bottom example, is where the problem to low savings is that they have developed a product, sort of like, instead of you buying stored value top-up cards, you buy store value that actually save money into your bank account. And so this is to attract people who have impulse buying. So you attracted to buying, so you buy these top-up savings instead of top-up spending. Another example that we pointed out is getting job seekers to be committed to, going for jobs or applying for jobs, right? But quite often we don't have the willpower to actually apply for those jobs regularly, right? But here is where, with a bit of nudging through personalized feedback and reminders and all that, they actually have managed to increase the recruitment applicants by about 23% over a period. These are some of the studies that have been conducted. By the way, this is just to touch on some of the issues around willpower, people's willpower. Let's go on. Now, identity. People are quite often attached to their identity, and because of that, they don't move ahead. So, for example, 1/3 of Ethiopian families believe that destiny was the single most important determinant of success. destiny is like takdir. Sometimes we believe he takdir. So if you are poor, your takdir is being poor, right? So these families in Ethiopia, they don't escape poverty because of this belief, right? So quite often these campaigns that tell people this and that, sometimes they're not well accepted because they feel this information is not for me. So you need to tailor information uh, more suited to these people. I won't go into it. There's research that goes on behind there, but I want to touch on the concept behind people's identity. Now, a contrasting example in Madagascar and Morocco, parents there believe that unless you can afford to send your children all the way to high school means the secondary school, a high level like from five and from four and from five, you know, and lower six, for instance. Unless you can send it at that level, there's no point to send your children to school at all. So they drop out early because of that. But the behavior that we want to induce them is that these parents understand that every year there is a gain, and that gains is actually has a return, in terms of how much these young people can earn. So through a program of educating the parents, right, they have shown that they are able to increase the number of years that students spend in school. Let's move on. Now, I mentioned also about social norm. People actually care about the social behaviors. So I think in the UK, what they did was that they saw that doctors actually don't really pay their taxes on time. So they want to encourage doctors to pay their taxes. They send letters to these doctors with a moral message to tell them that doctors are supposed to be trustworthy, so you also should be trustworthy, so you should submit your tax and pay your tax, etc. And the result is actually has been an increase. When we show percentages like this, these are statistical percentages, but they move the needle. And as you go on in time, you can actually have a big jump, as opposed to you not moving the needle at all in terms of getting behavioral change. And the last example here is that, in India and Bangladesh, for instance, about 25% of teachers and 19% of teachers in India and Bangladesh, respectively, are not present in school. So they notice that instead of highlighting those which are not present, you should highlight the norm. The norm is that, the balance, which is 75 and 81%, actually are present. So you make this as a social norm that you highlight. I think Shahidi, you mentioned last week about incentivizing teachers, with what bonus or something, right?
Loss aversion, loss aversion, yeah.
Loss aversion, right? So that's also another good example. So I'm just touching on these four bottlenecks called attention, willpower, identity, social norms, right? I'm touching on them just to give an idea that when we research, we are researching based on people's behavior. And here, a bigger snapshot of the research is delivery teams in the implementing agency of the government or the corporations, and should look at those issues with behaviors at the individual level, and then expand it to the situational level. What is the context they are facing? And then expand it further to what is the environment that they are in. If they're in a rural location, or they live in flats, for instance, the conditions are different, so they affect the behaviors. And you should also look at various data. Like, for instance, some of the things we mentioned are measurable, quantitative, qualitative data, and experiment with those data, both quantitative and qualitative. Do experiments on it and come up with research. I'm not going to go into how you actually do research. Academics are good at that. Consultants also good at that. They can do the research. But know that as policymakers, you need to look at it holistically, research a little bit, So don't assume that smokers behave that way, simply because of education. It's not just that. It's other things as well.
Mr. Eddie, do you prefer to have your question earlier, or do you want it to be compiled and be asked later?
Actually, I don't mind the questions earlier because then it's quite relevant to what we're
In the
talking.
flow, yeah? Because there are a few questions today. We have very attentive viewers. Yeah. One of the first question is from Asohan Sakku Nagisham. She asked, how do we get the government to shift their mindset so that they start to work on policies by taking a root cause than a symptomatic approach to avoid U-turn in their decision making? And would the prime framework serve to work on this shift?
Yes, yes, Aswan, thank you. You hit the nail on the head because you mentioned about U-turns in policies, right? We have seen quite a number of U-turns in policies over the years. And what happens is that it's a bit embarrassing because the policymaker believes that, they have taken everything to account, but it doesn't work. Things don't work. So then having that U-turn actually then shows that not enough foresight has gone into it. But many of the faults with these policies is that many times it doesn't take into account people's behaviors, and this is what we want to highlight. That what MPC wants to highlight. Okay, so in the past we look at things economically. We have a policy cycle. Right, we look at economic factors, and then we have, automatically you have an outcome because it is policy, or you have rules and regulations, right? But it doesn't work because people's behavior influences things. So for instance, in the past we have a policy that all kedai mamak must close by 10 p.m. and then sudden, because of all the vice actually happens because of that. It's not a well thought out policy because there's no research there. It's just an assumption.
True.
Or you have a policy where all the you open up Sepang for mat rempits to race and all that. It's also not well thought out. And then you do that for 1 or 2 times, and you have to U-turn the policy because you did not take into account the reason people behave, why they do these things. So yes, I do think it's a good thing, and I think the prime framework is for policymakers to think around the subject and think how the behaviors can be embedded when you make these policies.
There's also a question from Nazreen, where he or she asks, is there a correlation between culture, history, and religion of a particular ethnic group with behavior that consists of the values that translate into an economic progress? Correlation between culture, history, and religion. And another question is, in your own experience, Mr. Eddie, how is Malaysia different from Singapore, and does behavior impact economic progress?
Very good question. Exactly. I think you also hit the nail on the head. Culture.
Mr. Nazreen is a he.
Sorry? He, yeah? Okay. Mr. Nazreen, yes. Culture, religion, race, etc. Yes, all that. So you look at this slide that we have on the screen, right? So the individual or the community, right, has a situation, a context. Okay, that could be the culture or that could be the religion. And then that sits within a structured environment, whether the person is well off or poor or rural or urban, etc., right? Or educated, etc. So yes, it does affect. So the second question is also very interesting. What do I think is the difference between Singapore and Malaysia? Oh, that's quite a loaded question. I think in Singapore, it is a little easier to achieve success because of 2 things. One is the geography. Of course, it's smaller, but it's also more homogeneous. It's a more homogeneous population. So because of that, it is easier to shape behaviors. And by the way, Actually, Singapore has shaped a lot of good behaviors, that is a fact. So over the years, they have inculcated a lot of good behavior, and that good behavior actually helped the country progress. So you remember in the old days, they used to have a lot of fines and all that, right? So they use policy, right? But they also use positive reinforcement, So for instance, by providing a lot of facility, easy access to health services, or even to go around, the walkways are nicely covered and all that. Those actually are a lot of behavioral interventions were done. So in the past, I remember in my younger days, there was a fine for spitting, but now people don't spit. But the interesting thing was, in the old days, people actually spit a lot, I guess.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, so we also should look at how we can change behaviors, and I think we tend to rely on policymakers to expect us to change, but I think pockets of behavioral change can, social groups can also think about behavioral changes among communities.
Okay, may I add a bit regarding
Sure.
Singapore, because I found Singapore to be emphasizing on behavioral since few years back lagi pun. They've started looking at all the behavioral data and stress level of the staff, of the students. So I think in that sense, realization also plays a part. They realize the issue way earlier than we are, but I guess it's not too late, Mr. Adi.
Yeah. Not indeed, of course, not too late. So many countries are implementing behavioral insights because, just simply look at it this way, it saves a lot of money for government. It just saves a lot of money. It sounds like this is not really this is like soft issue and all that, right? Not serious, right? Some countries say, we don't need behavior insight, just have a law, pump, implement, enforce, pump, done. No, actually that costs more money. So the smart way to do it is through behavioral insights.
Okay, Steady. You may continue with your side.
Okay, so I carry on, yeah.
Yeah.
So we've looked at the purpose, we look at the research, and now we look at the actually doing the intervention. So I highlighted about the bottlenecks, just to give an idea. There are many components inside there, but just to give an idea how you think about it. Now, how should you think about implementing or designing the intervention? So now we put it into simple ways for you to think. This one, straightforward, welcoming, interpersonal, fact-based, timely. That means, well, we chose an acronym. Everything we try to make it an acronym so that it's easy for you to remember, like PRIME, and in this case is SWIFT. You try to make your intervention straightforward, welcoming, interpersonal, fact-based, and timely. And this is of course I can show you many interventions and all that, but let's say we frame it how these interventions are designed. So let's look at some examples here. So making your intervention straightforward means reducing the options. Don't have too many options. Maybe have default options, easy for people. So when you design websites and forms, make it easy to access and navigate. Okay? So quite often, last week, I think we mentioned about it's so difficult sometimes for you to apply for, let's say, Wi-Fi service from a particular vendor. It's so complicated. In the end, you just accept whatever you have, even though the bandwidth is no good. This is an example. So for instance, government services, for instance, let's say they give an incentive, but the process of applying for that incentive or their loan is so difficult that you don't apply, and then they don't get a good take-up rate. And then at the implementing agency, the ministry is asking why your this one doesn't work, and then they blame the public. The public doesn't understand, doesn't want the money. It's actually because sometimes the policies are too complicated. So let's look at this example. In Morocco, 70% of households applied for pipe water because there are steps, and these steps, they have a process of helping them with these steps, as opposed to before that only 10% of people apply for pipe water. Simple, huh? Second one, welcoming. Make your interventions welcoming. Use welcoming language. not top-down kind of language. Use attractive visual elements, interactivity, gamification. So, for instance, this is quite funny in South Africa, for instance, for low-income loans, they noticed that using female pictures for male applicants actually increased take-up. It's just an example. How actually you make the concept welcoming. You could say it's a bit of marketing. You could say that, but it's a strategy to induce the behavior.
I guess it's funny because it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Next is make your interventions personal or interpersonal. So, for instance, you have reminders. Make it personal to the addressee. Like for instance, I think in the past, TNB actually used the services of a company called WILLPOWER. WILLPOWER they use a lot of behavioral insights. They are a company that manage energy usage reporting. So WILLPOWER was eventually bought over by Oracle, and I'm not sure whether TNB still uses their services. But what TNB did at that time was that they showed your energy usage versus your neighbor's energy usage. And then they show your energy usage versus people in similar households. So, for instance, let's say terrace houses, what is the kilowatt hours of energy is used? They compare. So, when people see this kind of message, it feels very personal, especially the one that shows their neighbors, how much their neighbors are consuming. So, it helps to drive electricity consumption down. So, next one is try to make your interventions based on facts. Provide solid facts. So, for instance, solid facts is you have to also make your facts based on heuristics and rules of thumb, not just facts. So, for instance, if you say that you give a percentage, you say that for you to brush your teeth, you only should use 330 ml of water. People just cannot relate to that. But if you say, it's about 1 can of water, 1 can of Coke, for instance, equivalent, right? People can imagine how much that is. So there's an example of seaweed farming in Indonesia, where they actually focus on what is important in that seaweed farming, between the distance between the they call it pods, between the pods and the size of the pods. They give this actual exact information, because quite often people have assumptions. The farmers had assumptions that this worked this way. But actually with real fact-based information, they actually managed to increase the output of these farmers in Indonesia. And my last example here is, I keep it simple. Timing, of course, reminders are very good for telling you when to actually intervene, when to do it, because you receive a reminder, right on there. This one I don't have to explain. You look at it, I think you fairly understand, right? Any questions about this?
So far no. Oh no, there's one from Michael Barcelona. Barcelona. Since we have ongoing pandemic, so how can we relate the current situation on intervention with colleagues? Also, what are the risks that will be involved? I repeat, Mr. Adi, since we have ongoing pandemic, how can we relate the current situation on intervention with colleagues? Not really sure what that means. Also, what are the risks that will be involved?
Well, okay, let me comment. I mean, you mentioned about the pandemic, right? I think in the last presentation I shared about the most powerful interventions, actually behavioral interventions. This is before the vaccine came. The behavioral interventions is actually wearing a mask, washing hands, social distancing, and all that. And these actually need human behaviors to change. So let's compare that with countries like the United States, for instance, right? US. They have 4% of the world's population, but 25% of the cases. Why? What is the reason? This is because people's behavior over there. Right? Of course, there was somebody who encouraged them not to wear masks, and did a lot of social distancing, things like that. So this is where we need to encourage those interventions even now during the pandemic. Because of the pandemic, we need to do that. Even now that the vaccine is already available, in the US recently, Biden has said that, look, wear the mask for 100 days. Please wear the mask for 100 days because we need 100 days to administer the vaccine in about 80% of the population, something like that. So if you don't do that, then the vaccination will not work. So you see, you need behavioral intervention together with the science of vaccination. Right? So that is an example of treatment for the pandemic. But at the same time, I think this is a good time for us to think about behavioral insights on other good things that we should think about. For example, now we actually study from home. Classes are conducted, school is conducted at home, right? So there are certain behavioral change there. Business travel also is people are saying that when the pandemic is over, business travel will actually not be so prevalent like before. People you don't actually need to travel for business. Maybe you need to travel for holidays, but for business, actually, we have proven that you don't need to. So when you travel less, actually, companies spend less money, and then also carbon footprint also there. Anyway, these are just something to think about. That if you think that these are good behaviors for the country and all that, there are many things that you can induce, and this is a good time to touch on that. Okay.
There's also another question from Mr. Muhammad Hosni. He asked, how BI react if the policy the policy is being criticized by minority, majority accept it?
Yeah. So that question is a bit needs more clarification. What is the reason the minority criticize the policy, and what is the reason the majority criticize it? So are those criticisms valid? It is true sometimes policies are unfair to some groups. That is true. This is called it's called the majority. I forgot the name of it. The majority overrides the minority. So sometimes the bigger good sometimes overrides the minor good. So sometimes the minority then will not be happy because they don't get. But the question is that are those points fair? If they're not fair to the minority, also you need to look at that. I think in the US they grapple with this, the minorities and the majority and all that. Huh? Yeah. But that's a good point. But I think you need to dissect the question a little bit further.
Yeah, it's quite general. And there's another two questions. One is from Mr. Roland Konanen, and another one is again from Mr. Nazri. So I'll read the question of Mr. Roland first. With today's situation, it is difficult to conduct study, especially with regards to the involvement of community. How can we obtain data which is reliable and precise in relation to behavior? Do you want me to read the second question, Mr. Eddie?
No, we'll answer this question one first. I think a lot of these kind of study, you want to receive feedback. when you want to receive feedback, actually there's no reason why you cannot do it digitally, except that when you go to rural communities, it might be a bit difficult. But another way that you want to receive the information is through observation. That one I think is a bit difficult at the moment. You can't observe people. So for instance, you can't go out in the street and look at how people behave, because people don't behave the same way now. So there is a bit of difficulty. But if you want to receive feedback, maybe for behavioral research, you might need to do something called ethnography research. Consultants and academics are very good in doing that. Look at the ethnography, how people behave, and certain, and you know what is their identity and things like that. You can actually do it digitally. We did research in Saudi Arabia. I was involved in doing a lot of research in the communities in Saudi Arabia, and although we are not from that country, we are still able to reach out to those communities and engage them. Sometimes digitally, sometimes by phone. You can interview, or many times in person. But again, like I mentioned, to observe the behaviors are quite difficult at the moment. Next question.
From Mr. P.W. Wong, it's quite related to this. He asked, could you please give your views on the important role of digitalization and data analytics to enable better targeting of intended group and in designing behavioral intervention that attract attention through personal relevance and that are timely and fact-based? And how does our Malaysian government fare in this aspect?
Okay, this is the question actually is relating to data science,
Yep.
Data mining, algorithms, right? And digital, maybe you can say digital services and all that. So this is very relevant. Actually, in behavioral science, a lot of these people who design the algorithms take into account behavioral science. It is very relevant. So when you look at Facebook, for instance, how come they know so much about you? When you think about something already, of course, maybe they're listening. I'm not saying they are, but maybe they're listening. People are saying, but even if they're not listening, they can see your behavior patterns, and they can predict most likely you're interested in this and that. So yeah, how do they do that? They're not even there, but they use algorithms and behavior matching, etc. They use all that, a lot of data scientists. So it's very important. But it is not perfect. But they, over the many iterations, over a huge population, they test and test and test, and it gets better and better and better. So yes, it is very good. In Singapore, for instance, they are looking at a smart nation concept, where then this data mining, data science, and all that permeates throughout. But it's of course an easier demographic to manage. But comparatively, I think in Malaysia we should start looking at it. I think there's some. It is beginning to be looked at, although there's now maybe everything is sort of put on hold, but it is something that they should look at, and I think they will start looking at. And behavioral interventions associated to digitalization is an important aspect, because if you want to have, let's say you want to have a functioning digital economy or functioning digital society, you need to take into account people's responses.
And I would like to add a bit, because this is basically what our company do, what our company does. To be honest, in terms of digitalization and data analytics, we do have a lot of methods, not just from simple questionnaires. There's also psychometric surveys and etc. But we also have web scraper. Are you familiar with web scraper, Mr. Eddie?
Web scraper? No, maybe explain.
Yeah, because we basically look at certain words, keywords, where we will try and find using the machine. For example, our latest project under UN grant on social cohesion. We try to see social cohesion between Malay and Chinese. So we try to find word Chinese and how many are being used and how they use it. So that kind of thing, I think, is part of this behavioral science and it's part of technology. But Mr. Wong also asked, how does Malaysia government fare in this aspect?
Well, you know better, Syahidi.
So far, it's they are starting to accept, I guess. That is the word, but it used to be quite hard last time. And there's another question from Mr. Nazrin.
I think if I can touch on that point, maybe go back to the original, the first slide there, where I talk about the overall policy. You can use web scraping, for instance, to look at, some keywords and do matching. I think the big companies like Google and Facebook, they do that all the time. You can do that, but the important thing is that what is the purpose of doing that?
Yeah.
So in the case here in the United Nations, I think they want to study at what level. I think we don't have to wait for the UN to study this. We should study it ourselves, and we should know ourselves, and we should have policies that look at this. Rather than somebody tell us about this and that, we should actually engage in these studies ourselves. It is really not difficult. We can easily give grants to the likes of you to do it. Coming back to that, what is that purpose of that policy?
Yeah.
What is the intention? What do you want the outcomes to be from your population? Do you look at those outcomes to be something that is overall beneficial to your population and your society and your nation and the progress of a nation? If you look at it like that, you will engage in it, and you will use all the digital tools, embed that with behavioral tools, and go for it. We should do that.
It's just a medium for all these tools, these digital tools. Mr. Nazrin mentioned that it's interesting, Mr. Eddie, that you mentioned about Biden administration, about the 100 days, I guess. Paradoxically, the Trump administration behaved in a way that influenced a huge swath of the population that translate into how the world behaves towards America. My question is this evidence that leaders influence the behavior of a community, and shouldn't change come from the top?
Okay, this is actually a very interesting question. Most people think it comes from the top, but actually the top is actually reaching into the bottom. The top is reaching into the bottom. So in the case of Trump, for instance, he reached to the bottom because he knows that the base, this is what they want. And who is his base? His base is conservative. Yeah? And if you dig deeper into the base of conservatives, it's actually, maybe in America, I can comment. I can comment about America. So even if they are not happy with me, it doesn't matter. But the base is actually Christian evangelists. A lot of them are Christian evangelists. So it is based on a religion and conservatism. So it is not the top. It is actually the top reaching to the bottom, because this is what the bottom feels and believes. Right? So it is very hard because it is based on a belief. Conservative and religion is a belief. In a way, it's a behavior too, and the politicians utilize that, and then they look at they brand the Democrats as liberals. So you have conservative and liberal. If you are conservative, you just don't jive with the liberals, vice versa. So even in other countries, even here also we have conservative and we have liberals. So actually you can say that it is you can say it's race and religion. Actually, it's also the bigger picture is actually conservative idealism and liberal idealism. So politicians are only reaching out to what you believe in. So maybe this is where it is important. Some countries are looking at nationalism as a more important ideology or behavior thing that we should try to shape. Idealism of nationalism. regardless of race, religion, or conservatives or liberal nationalism. Maybe that's one way of thinking about it. By the way, this question is
It take a
is
lot of
very
time.
provoking. Thank you for
Yeah.
the question. Very interesting.
I guess you may continue because right now the time is 10:50. Yeah.
Okay. Um, so actually, I'm coming towards the end of
Okay.
the slide. I mean, I hope what I've shown here, I wanted it to be more in terms of examples and more dialogue, because the last presentation we didn't have much time for questions. So today I'm glad we have a bit more time for questions. But this is really a snapshot of how you should think about the framework of implementing behavioral insight. There is a framework document. It's an e-document. You can get it from NPC. There's more detail on how this thing is applied. But the important thing is now to look back at your purpose and your overall policy area, your specific policy goals, your demographics, and the measurable outcomes you want based on a certain time frame. You look at the purpose, and then you do a bit of research there. You look at the citizens' behavior. Remember, we talked about the bottleneck, right? Uh, Attention, willpower, identity, and social norm, for instance. And then you relate it to the situation and the structure where these behaviors then sit. Right? And I won't go into how you do that research. Academics can help you, consultants can help you with that, right? But just know the overall process. And then you, as a policy delivery team, then you work with these people. Don't just work within many policy delivery teams in implementing agencies, in government, even in NGOs. They think they figure it out without doing any research, and actually that's why sometimes they have policy U-turns.
Mm.
And then you go into actually designing the interventions. And there are many behavioral insights tools. Um, if we were to list all of them, that's it's quite easy to research them. But the point is that how you use them, and we are showing that try to think of it as something that is swift, straightforward, welcoming, interpersonal, fact-based, and timely. So try to look at it, and that's how you apply those behavioral insight interventions. Also look at whether it is practical, it's measurable, and what are the demographic that you're going to apply it. So I'm going to stop there, PRI, and next session I'm going to talk about measuring and expanding those interventions.
There's
Maybe.
another question. There's another question from Mr. Nazrin again. Very wonderful, Mr. Nazrin. He asked, can behavior be part of an economic indicator and also an FDI attracting tool? What he means is this. In the pandemic era, he sees that countries powering ahead by changing behaviors. For example, SOP, handling the pandemic, like in China. Countries who don't handle behavior well will be left behind. Can this be the new KPI? Can BI be the new KPI?
Oh yes, I think certainly. Um, when we look at previous KPIs, many countries they use traditionally you use GNP as a master KPI. Uh, Now we call it GNI, gross national income, as a master KPI, and then you look at all the economic returns and all that. But now with things like awareness of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, for instance, you begin to look at other KPIs like social KPIs, social outcomes, and all that. And behavioral insights is more of a tool for those KPIs. Think of it as a tool for you to shape their behaviors for those KPIs. And yet, so hence you should have KPIs on people's behaviors as well. You should at least have a database, at least have an awareness. So as government, then we should actually be aware what is the adaptability of our population, what is the innovative capacity, the creative capacity, or the versatility of corporate. We should have those kind of things. In many countries, they want to develop technology. Let's say they want to develop smart cities, for instance. So they introduce a lot of technology. But if you don't take into account the response from the people in the city, how they adopt to the technology, whether it's convenient for them, whether it's easily used and all that, then that's how those cities, they excel. And I must say that in countries in China, I think, for instance, um, not only is the country focusing on technology, they also are good in uh, managing. You mentioned in China, for instance, they not just managing the behaviors, but encouraging people to be adaptable. Of course, you don't go against the big forces, but allow people to be adaptable. So, if I may draw the example of Jack Ma, for instance. So, okay, what is important to see is that you may want to regulate the financial tools that he has developed, but the important thing is that he has developed a way that people behave in response. Not just him, like it's actually Alipay and Tencent and WeChat Pay and things like that. They have developed a way that people respond to technology and utilize the technology, and this is actually the catalyst. And so China is very fast in that. We are now beginning to use digital tools for payments and all that, but we are not as fast. Why is that? So this is example where the behaviors, how people respond to certain interventions, actually help to drive the economy.
A final question from Mr. Nazrin. He asks, the HR department has always been seen as the forgotten sister. Does the HR function play a vital role now in this new normal?
Well, maybe you can elaborate the question, but of course, the HR department is very important now because of the pandemic. Everybody's asking, for guidance from the HR, like for instance, work from home, SOP, can I come in, all that. But I think when you say new normal, the question is, we're really not sure after the pandemic is over, what is that new normal? Does it go back to the past, or is it going to be different? Maybe some things will be different. But I think when you talk about the new normal, I think we should look at it beyond the pandemic. We should look at it as the new normal is actually driven by people's usage of technology. That is the real new normal. So, to touch on your question, the role of the HR, I think, will be very important for this use of technology. So people are saying now 30% of jobs are going to vanish, right? so HR then will be managing the balance of 70%, so things like that. That is more of the HR future work issues.
Yeah. Mr. Nazrin did elaborate a bit about HR. For him, he wants to know in terms of finding key behavior in personal and potential candidates. I guess the question is, do we look into behavioral aspect of a candidate in terms of getting this new staff or managing the staff?
I think that one is maybe that one is more in the realm of psychology, or psychological assessment or behavioral assessment. It's not quite the same as this kind of behavioral interventions, which are meant for policymakers to nudge good behaviors. I think in corporation, the HR, I think is you don't need those kind of interventions so much.
And Mr. Dr. Muhammad Jahangir Ali asked how the embedding behavioral insight into, I think, how do we embed behavioral insight into health policy making in terms of health?
Oh, I think behavioral insight is very important for health outcomes. Um, there are, again, we mentioned the pandemic, you have behaviors and you have science, right? So when it comes to non-communicable diseases like diabetes, right? And things like smoking, for instance, all these actually, the biggest intervention is actually behavioral. That's where you should target. And that's where the cost is actually the lowest. So yes, it plays a big part in healthcare. I think.
And it will
By the
take,
way, I want to mention something. In the future, right? A lot of interventions. Somebody asked about digitalization. A lot of interventions actually will be self-managed interventions in healthcare. So, for instance, you as an individual, when you are able to see your own information instead of waiting for the doctor to tell you, if you're able to see the information, you can manage it. You should manage it. So this is the in advanced countries. The latest Apple Watch, for instance, Apple Watch Series 6. You can see your blood oxygen levels, for instance. Why do we need to see that? Right? Because this is managing your own healthcare. So as time goes on, there's actually a lot of tools actually for you to manage healthcare, not just in terms of devices, but in terms of the information that comes from these devices. So that is a very important aspect of healthcare, where you then manage your own healthcare. It puts less of a burden on the hospital system and the government.
yeah,
Yeah.
I am someone who monitor everything, my sleep, my run, my heart rate,
Oh,
etc.
yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And for your info, Mr. Adi, Dr. Muhammad Jahangir just now is from Oman actually. He's a associate professor in accounting and finance in Department of Business Administration and Accounting in Al Buraimi University College.
Thank you for joining us from so far. Thank you.
So I guess that's it for today. Do you have any final words or any last message that you want to give before we end our session today, Mr. Adi?
Okay, so I just want to flash this slide just to wrap up, just to give a picture. Last week we talked about principles and theories, and today we talk about design strategies, and next week we will talk about delivery process. Our intention is not to go into so much detail, but more to trigger your mind to think about how these behavioral insights can be useful. And I appreciate all the questions that have been asked, because that means you're thinking about the application into a lot of aspects, even US politics and China as well, So I find that very interesting that you're looking at how, and we talk a lot about technology and all that. So you're looking at how it can apply in the bigger picture. I think that is very good, because then it will encourage a level of acceptance, not just as a simple tool, but more as a very powerful process that can be used for policymakers. So I think that's it. That's all I'm going to chat about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Adi. Today's session, in my opinion, is very wonderful, very interactive. Thanks to all the viewers for asking questions. And thanks especially to everyone, not just from Malaysia. We can see a lot of our viewers are from a lot of countries. So we appreciate your effort in listening, and we appreciate your effort, Mr. Eddie, for giving wonderful webinar. And thank you to MPC for organizing this. And as we know, today is actually our second session, second series of Behavior Insight Framework. We will be having another session on 9th February. For the third one, we'll be discussing about the ME, Mr. Eddie.
Yes.
So I guess
we will discuss about the measurement expansion. We'll touch on other things like stakeholders that we have to look at. we've touched on a bit on ethics and all that around it. That's very important as well. And we'll look at governance as well, those kind of things.
So will be an interesting session, another interesting session. So I would like to invite all of the viewers today to come and join us again. And so that's it for today. Stay safe, everyone, and take care. See you guys in another session on the 9th. Yeah. So that's it. Bye. Thank you. Assalamualaikum.
Yeah.